Although we have already discussed relative paths for traits in the previous lessons, there's more to static and relative paths that you need to know. In this example, we have a single trait called FancyBox. It's inside this index file, and we have a flow inside it that just modifies the background color of the container. So in this example, we've already used the static path to navigate to this trait. So the static paths, as already discussed before, they start inside the dashboard folder. So you need to specify any folders and files within the dashboard folder. So to get to our trait, we go into lessons, then 23 static versus relative paths / FancyBox. In your IDE, like we have discussed, you can get the path. In Sublime Text, I can right click the file and I can click copy the path. Then of course just remember to remove everything before, remove dashboard and remove the .json. So as we've also discussed, we can use relative paths instead, and relative paths starts inside the folder where we are now. So we are currently inside the 23 static versus relative paths folder, meaning that if we just do // we're accessing a trait within the current folder. If we move this into a folder there, it's called FancyBox, move it. Now we'll have to specify /FancyBox /FancyBox. We can also go a folder up if for some reason the FancyBox folder was in a higher folder. So now it's inside the lessons folder, which is one folder up. We go // meaning we go up into the FancyBox folder, and the file is also called FancyBox. There are situations in which relative paths will not work and you'll have to use static paths. And that is when you're specifying a relative path anywhere except inside a traits array, as specifically as the trait key. For example, if we wanted to do something like this, we just move this back. So we put FancyBox back in 23. So let's say we had another thing in here for the label. Let's put the label inside its own trait. I'm just going to copy this, call it label.json, accept props, just to make it a trait. And now inside FancyBox, we can instead access the trait. So now we're going to use, for now we're going to use relative over here. So it's going to be // label, because we want to access the label trait within our own folder. So this should still work fine. It's broken. Just fix this again. So FancyBox is inside the current folder, inside the FancyBox folder. And then we see our label, FancyBox. So if we wanted to pass the label in dynamically, let's say we had two label props. Let's duplicate this, make the other one label 2, and let's make this one just a different color. So now we can render label or label 2 being the red one. If we wanted to make this dynamic, we have an accept prop for trait path label. It's a string, and we can default it to // label. And then instead of this, we can go percentage trait path label, which we are defaulting. Now you'll see that it breaks. When you use traits, you will get errors like these. Physically, you'll see in your browser, you'll see that it doesn't exist, and you'll see that this hasn't actually been resolved. So it's trying to access it just directly. When traits are resolved, the full path will be put in front. So if you're trying to access something through, let's do it like this. Let's say let's just put 1, 2, 3 there. So now instead of FancyBox folder, we're accessing the wrong folder. Then you'll see that it actually did resolve. So even though we specified the relative path, it did resolve here, but the file does not exist. But in cases where something didn't resolve at all, like in this situation, we see that this did not resolve. It means that you're using a relative path in a position where relative paths do not resolve. So as mentioned, relative paths will only resolve if you use them inside the trait key. So if I physically had something in here, which is relative path, because this is dynamic, it's done at runtime, not at compile time, meaning that the Opus packager can't resolve this for us. So what we need to do then is specify the full path, or the static path over there, which will be lessons. So now we have the default to the static path. Now this will work. And then in the same way, if we wanted to pass it in, it has to be the full path because it won't resolve. So if I wanted to do fancy box label 2, it will not work. I have to do the static.